Professor Lennox, what a pleasure. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's delightful to be in contact with someone who lives in my old home city, Cardiff.
I know. It's a small world, and there's some kind of coincidences on our part. I feel as if this conversation has been kind of a long time in the making. We've been doing this show since 2019. You've been a incredibly heavily requested guest, so it's a privilege to finally make it happen. One of the ideas I think that not just myself, but I know a number of other people find most thought-provoking about yours is that I feel as if there have been many people out there that have really tried to try to create a distinction between things like faith, theism, and science. Now, you've really helped kind of shape my thinking on this, and you've kind of introduced the idea that perhaps this gap isn't as big as some people might think, and perhaps there might not even be one there in any case. So I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate on that.
Well, certainly. I think, first of all, we'd need to clarify what you mean by faith. I take it you mean objective sense, religion, Christianity, and so on. And for most of my life, really, I've never seen a real difficulty here, because very early on, when I was a boy, I learned that the major pioneers of modern science, you can start with Galileo, then Kepler, Newton, and so on, were all believers in God. And I learned, I think, from Lewis, that C.S. Lewis, that that was no accident. And he was summing up a very famous philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, when he said this is Lewis, he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. In other words, the pioneering time of modern science, 16th, 17th centuries, faith in God actually drove the scientific impulse. It was the motor that was behind it. And these people saw absolutely no contradiction between their faith in God and their faith in science. And I'm expressing that deliberately because I think there's a huge confusion in the culture today as to what faith means, because Richard Dawkins and co. have spread abroad the idea, and it's taken root, that faith is a religious term and it means believing where there's no evidence. And in fact, it's an ordinary term that means believing where there is evidence. Faith, believing where there's no evidence, is blind faith and is not worth thinking about. And therefore, I see the world in both senses, that I have faith in science, and I have faith in the human mind to do science because I believe in a creator that created it. And I see no conflict there. Now, I can develop that more closely because I think, well, let me give you two quotations which have meant quite a bit to me. The Nobel Prize winner Lawrence Bragg said, faith and science are opposed, just as the thumb and the fingers are opposed, so that between them we can grasp everything. And the late Lord Sachs, the chief rabbi in the UK, said, well, science tells us how to understand how things work, and religion tells us what they mean. And I think that's a pretty useful, it's not completely accurate, but a pretty useful way of approaching these things. And we need both of those dimensions, how things work and what they mean. And there's usually no conflict between the how questions and the why questions, unless you, for some arbitrary reason, like Dawkins and co., ban the why questions and say they're meaningless, when in fact they're the most important questions human beings can ask. That's a short version. I mean, here I'm sitting in Oxford, or near Oxford, and the motto of the university still is Dominus Illuminatio Mea. The Lord is my light or my illumination. And the people that founded Oxford saw no conflict in studying everything. This is God's world and therefore worth studying. So I find that, well, I understand atheism because I've spent a lot of my life engaging with it. But as a scientist, I'm not remotely embarrassed to say I'm both a Christian and have a lot of time for science. I'm passionate about it.
One of the things that I find was that I found to be quite a culturally significant moment kind of in this conversation was, of course, as you mentioned, people like Richard Dawkins. Of course, there's been a number of other people that have been quite vocal on this front. But I found the late Professor Stephen Hawking, in The Grand Design, he famously said, "Philosophy is dead." And I'm curious what you thought of that.
Well, I must say I had a preview of that book, and well, I think what follows bears out what the astronomer royal Martin Rees said about Hawking, is that he knows no theology and very little philosophy, and I didn't listen to him on either. And to say philosophy is dead at the beginning of a book which is essentially on the philosophy of science is very silly indeed. And it just shows that, well, there's a lovely quote by Richard Feynman, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, and he said, outside his field, the scientist is as dumb as anybody else. And when Hawking starts talking about philosophy, about which he knows nothing, he comes into the category of what someone has called, I can't remember the name, the learned ignoramus. In other words, somebody who's highly specialized in one field but has no clue about another one in which he's making pronouncements. It was rather sad because it was just ridiculous. And philosophy is dead, he said, and therefore its science must bear the torch of truth or something like this in the generations to come. That to me, and then I examined the book in detail and then wrote a book about Hawking's views, because I really felt that for him to use his authority to scare people almost, or browbeat them into thinking there was no God on the basis of that kind of argument, well, it needs to be exposed. So that's what I did.
Indeed. And as you said, this imaginary divide that people have tried to create between science and faith. You mentioned a number of really interesting, really prominent scientific figures: Newton, Kepler, Maxwell, Faraday, yourself. Clear illustrations that there doesn't have to be this divide, which people have perhaps tried to push on us.
No, there doesn't. Hawking was the one who really said, and I puzzled about it for quite a while, you've got to choose between science and God. And that shows huge confusion. Sometimes when I'm talking to school children, I say, look, here are two explanations of a motor car, one in terms of physics and automobile engineering, and the other, Henry Ford. Which one is true? And even 10-year-olds say, but sir, you must have both. And why some scientists can't see that, I am simply amazed. And I often put it this way: God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with automobile engineering as an explanation of the motor car. They're like complementary explanations if they're understood properly. And they're really answering different questions, how and why, for the most part.
On this topic, you are incredibly respected in this area, and you've gone head to head on several very public platforms with numerous people in the field: Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer, etc. One of the questions that came in was that we were kind of asked a number of times was, did any of these conversations did they ever kind of shape or change your views in a way that you might not have expected?
Well, not really, except they strengthened my views that the atheist emperor has no clothes. You know, I take atheism seriously because I want to know what is true. But I discover that many of these people, they ask for evidence, but they don't listen when it's offered. And that, to my mind, is actually an anti-intellectual attitude, that they won't consider it, and they then demean themselves, actually, as public intellectuals by either mocking you or ridiculing what you have to say and simply denying it in a loud voice. And I find that totally unimpressive. It's therefore, it certainly didn't rock my faith. It established my faith, because I find that for most of my life, I've been interested in befriending, and I mean that, befriending people that don't share my worldview and exposing what I think to be true, my worldview, to theirs. And it's resulted, I've been doing it for, well, over 60 years. And I find nothing essentially but confirmation. People often say to me, Joe, they say, do you ever doubt? And I say, all the time. But what I mean by that is not what they mean by it. When the word doubt is used, people think of a kind of black hole of despair, as if the world is going to collapse around you. But doubt in the sense of questioning, allowing my faith in God and Christ to be questioned. I do it all the time. So if it's atheists like Peter Singer or Hitchens or any of them that are doing the questioning, well, that's fine. And I went head to head with them, as you say, simply because if no one does, and I'm not the only one who does, of course, but if no one does, people think that the atheists triumph by default, which is just not true. And I believe that into the public space, we should project all possible views so that people can choose on the basis of evidence. So that's my position, and I've tried to hold that position for a very long time.
And I feel as if you mentioned something really interesting there that we should really pick up on. And that was, of course, the question of doubt, the questioning that you mentioned. And I'm curious, has there been anything specific or anything really notable in your life that really led you to kind of question that existence in God? Or was it just something that you kind of wrestle with daily?
Well, I wouldn't call it wrestling. I'd call it a very interesting engagement of the mind. You see, let me go back to my youth. My parents were very unusual in Northern Ireland, particularly because they allowed me to think and encouraged me to think about all kinds of things. And they loved me enough not to force their Christianity down my throat, to put it crudely. So that I grew up with a very expansive view of Christianity as being the source of a great deal of thought. And the idea that Christians were narrow-minded people that didn't allow you to think, I would have laughed at in those days. So I owe quite a lot to my parents. And just reading and understanding intellectual history and the function of churches in the early centuries and the Middle Ages and later, and the towering thinkers. And, all of that gave me confidence in the truth of the Christian message. And for me, the word truth is the most important one. That is not that Christianity is helpful. Of course it is, but it can be quite painful. But is it true? Is this the right description of ultimate reality? And it's that has maintained me. And the more I investigate atheism, the more it falls to pieces.
What specifically about it, just out of curiosity, is it that when you start pulling at the evidence behind atheism, where does it start to fall down in your mind?
Well, it seems to me it becomes self-contradictory. I sometimes provoke people by saying Christianity and science fit very well together, but atheism and science don't fit well together. Why? Because science is or ought to be a rational investigation. But atheism, taken to its logical conclusion, actually undermines any kind of confidence that a scientist should have in the human mind. Because, I often have fun actually in talking to new people who are high-powered scientists, and I ask them what they do science with. And I tap my head and they say, oh, well, like you, I do science with my brain. And I say, well, I think the mind and the brain aren't quite the same thing, but let me accept what you say. Tell me about the brain. Give me the brief history of the brain. And they always say something, or usually say something like, the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and smile and say, and you trust it, do you? Now tell me honestly, if you knew that the computer that you use in your laboratory every day was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And the interesting thing, Joe, is I've used that many times and I've always got the answer, no, I would not. So I say, you've got a problem, haven't you? Because your view of the origin of what you call the mechanism that's doing science, the brain, actually undercuts any confidence you could have in it. Now, C.S. Lewis, he wasn't a scientist, but he understood argument. And he saw that years ago, that this kind of reductionism, that everything ends up being just physics and chemistry, it shoots itself in the brain, which is far worse than shooting yourself in the foot.
I love it. I love it. I'm one, of course, of the notable atheists that we've discussed about already. Richard Dawkins. I was listening to a podcast with him recently, on the Cosmic Skeptic Show, and excuse me, and Alex, the host, asked him about who on the question of God's existence that you had spoken with kind of was the most formidable opponent, and what were kind of the most thoughtful points. And Dawkins replied that there really hadn't been any good points to make. And I'm curious, kind of on this point, what has it been like kind of debating with Richard, and do you feel as if you've kind of shaped his views in any way?
No, I've no idea. It's very hard to say because he's a very difficult man to deal with. And I know Alex O'Connor, and I'm hoping to go on his Cosmic Skeptic show. I think he makes a very good fist at interviewing people. In fact, he's very good at that and very fair. And I'm amazed because I just think that Dawkins does not take argument and evidence seriously. He's always crying out about evidence, but if you offer him any, he doesn't examine it and he doesn't take it seriously. And the way he behaved particularly in the second debate with me was, well, it wasn't impressive. It was simple ridicule. Well, that's very easy to do. And I found that I didn't feel he was a formidable opponent, although debating him was a formidable thing in the sense that you're faced with a very large audience, and I had no idea the effect it was going to have because it gave me a public platform around the world for which I'm very grateful to in a way. So, but I just didn't feel, as I do with the other people, that I could get to know them. I tried to, but it didn't work.
As in Richard, he was kind of closed off a little bit, was it?
Yes. But, it's unfair to second guess somebody. And when I see someone as vehemently opposed as that, and there's not much rational ground, it reminds me of an Irish farmer who once said to me, if a man cannot see reason, then reason isn't his problem. That's worth reflecting on, actually.
If I may ask, what was it like in comparison to debating, Richard, spending time and chatting with someone that I greatly admire, which was Christopher Hitchens? What was that experience like?
I got on well with Christopher Hitchens because I met him. I met him in Edinburgh, where we did a debate at the Edinburgh Festival, which is very remarkable that the organisers of the festival decided to have a God debate. So I was asked to debate Christopher. He looked at me very quizzically. And I said to him, almost in the first few sentences, I said, I see that you are a contrarian. And he said, how do you know that? And I said, I read your book. And he was flabbergasted. You read my book? Sure. And he said, I haven't read any of yours. I said, that doesn't matter. And it completely changed his attitude. And we got on very well. Behind the scenes, particularly, we had several very good conversations. Of course, in public, Christopher was quite a showman. And, well, you can see from the debates I did with him what kind of showman he was. I would love to have been able to spend more time with him because I found him quite likable, although he was a rascal, really. An intellectual rascal, and he was far too dependent on Richard Dawkins.
I think he is someone that I think we've all missed a great deal. And I think a lot of people, myself included, really felt, I think, the great pain when he kind of left us. It
was very sad. It was very sad indeed. I agree with you entirely. Have you read the book that my friend Larry Taunton wrote about him, The Faith of Christopher Hitchens?
No, I'll have to give it a read.
Oh, that's worth reading. That's very interesting because he, of all people, had much more contact with Hitchens than I had or virtually any other Christian I know. It's a very interesting book.
I'll check it out. What do you think it was about Hitchens? You know, of course, he perhaps had, you know, his views, of course, on these topics that we're talking about, but it's very difficult to find people, particularly I think in this faith, that really held these kind of negative views on him. And I'm curious what it was that made him so likable.
Well, I find that hard to read. You're a psychologist. You would know more about that than I do. One of the things I found very interesting in that initial conversation, I asked him this question. I said, I see that most of your arguments come from a single source. And this surprised him. He said, what's that? I said, Tom Paine. And he said, you know, you're right. Tom Paine had a huge influence on me. And from that moment, I think he was prepared to take me seriously, which Dawkins was not. And I appreciated that. And certainly the two debates I had with him were extremely interesting, to say the least.
Ron, I'd love to kind of switch gears, and I'd love to kind of just try to tackle some of these other kind of really important questions that we're kind of looking at. And one of the things that I would really love to ask you, of course, is, and I'm sure you've been asked questions about this, but of course, when we're talking about a belief in kind of a God or, you know, in a faith like Christianity, one of the questions that kind of comes up on this is, hypothetically, if we get to the end of our lives and we've, you know, dedicated our lives to living, to believing in a certain way, and we end up being wrong, how do you think about something like that? What if we are wrong?
Well, I don't know any other way of dealing with that, apart from the way I have proceeded in my life, and to say, what is the evidence? What is the evidence that we're right? And of course, you could never, even in science, get 100%. But remember, I think it's important to realize that when we talk about God, we're not talking simply about a theory, but we're talking about a person, especially when it comes to God revealed in Christ. And getting to know a person is a different thing from getting to know a set of facts. It's a much deeper thing. And so part of the evidence, I often put it this way, part of the evidence that forms the basis of my belief that Christianity is true is what I roughly call the objective facts, the things in history and the things making sense, the whole criteria for truth, and the New Testament documents and all the rest of it. But there's another side to it, and that is that Christ comes into the world, makes certain claims that are recorded, and he claimed that if people were to trust him, then something would happen to them. They'd actually experience certain things, like forgiveness, peace with God, a certainty of life to come. Now, I've seen that happen so many times in my own life and other people's lives, particularly the transformation of life. And let me put it very simply. You meet a student who's in a desperate way, feeling very down and depressed, and nothing in life is going well, and so on and so forth. And then you meet her 6 months later, and she's absolutely beaming. And you say, what has happened to you? And she may formulate it in different ways. She may say, well, I've been born again, or I met Christ, or I've become a Christian. But the point is, there's the evidence that she's been transformed by something. And when you've seen that again and again, you begin to think, well, there's something in this. You certainly don't see that happening with people converting to atheism, as far as I'm in any substantial way. And it seems to me this is part of the evidence. I used to be slightly concerned when people would say to me, look, you're a scientist. In science, you can test things. Isn't that the key element in science? And I would say, yes, of course. Well, you can't test Christianity. Well, of course, thinking about it, I realized, of course, you can. Christ says that if people repent and trust him for salvation, then they receive peace with God, they receive forgiveness, and they receive a new power and a new life. And you can test that very easily. So that the idea of maybe I might be wrong, that fades. And it fades the older I get, actually. It's not that the nearer I get to death, the more uncertain I become, the more certain I become. And perhaps that's because I've lost my marbles, but I don't think so.
And when you describe that student that has been born again, that suddenly has that beam, to me that kind of infers kind of, and please fact check me or tell me, if you think I'm completely out of whack here, but that kind of paints to me a picture of almost a utopia, but kind of a utopia on earth, kind of this embodiment of these principles, which have then taken this person up to a level of, I'm not quite sure how to describe, but there's kind of this transformation of this,
Yeah, but it's not utopian thinking. Your question's important. People are not promised utopia, and the idea of heaven is later on. And one of the characteristics of Christianity, which I was discussing with someone just today, was we're not promised a smooth ride. And in fact, Christ said that anybody that wants to take him seriously will actually very often go through a rough time and suffer. But what you are given is a way of coping with that suffering. Not that you've got an answer to it in some formulaic sense, but it's, well, I think it's brilliantly expressed in the famous psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd." Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. Your rod and staff comfort me. That this is a God who has suffered, and that's a crucial part of the Christian faith. And if we got nothing to say to people who are suffering, then we've got nothing to say, full stop. And I have thought about that a great deal in life, because the pain and suffering issue is the hard question, whatever worldview you have. And the question is, what worldview makes the most sense and gives you the most insight so that you can handle it and bear it if necessary, as many people have to.
This kind of takes me back to a point that I heard Stephen Fry discuss in an interview where the interviewer said to him, should he approach the pearly gates and he saw God, what would he say? And Stephen Fry replied, bone cancer in children, what's that about? How dare you create a world in which there is so much misery that it's not our fault? Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who created a world that is so full of injustice and pain? And on this point, I guess that really does bring us to the point at which you described there about if there was this idea about why would a God kind of allow that kind of suffering? And you've got some really interesting views, I know, on this.
Well, I must be honest, I'm not impressed with that kind of reaction, because he's leaving out how much good there is in the world and how much good he himself has taken out of the world. And he might have to thank God for that. My own position on this is that kind of question, in the end, when it's looked at a philosophical level, is unanswerable. We've all asked ourselves, surely a good and powerful God would, should, could, must, all this kind of stuff when we were students, and we never got a satisfactory answer. And as a mathematician, I'm interested in questions that don't have satisfactory answers, because in mathematics, they're usually the wrong question. And so it's the approach that I adopt is to, and it's a mathematical one, is to say, am I here asking the wrong question? Because let's see what the facts are. As we look at this world, we see a mixed picture. I often call it bombs and barbed wire and beauty. On the one hand, there's so much beauty. On the other hand, there are bombs and barbed wire. And any philosophy worthy of the name, any worldview that could be taken seriously, must face those two issues. Now, my question is, and it's a harder question in a sense than the first one, but I think it takes us further. And it is granted that that is so. We all have to accept that. Is there anywhere any evidence that there is a God who understands it and could help us to live with it? And you see, it's in the Christian message of the cross that I see a God who's not remained distant from human suffering, but has become part of it. And the resurrection then changes everything. Now, these are very deep issues and very deep questions, but I find that they are the kind of approach that gives people hope. And that is a very important thing.
Perhaps I imagine the reaction to this podcast will be very large, and perhaps we may have to do another one in the future.
Well, what people can do is just go on the internet, because I have dealt with this kind of question in great detail in many lectures, particularly on the Veritas Forum in the United States, where I've dealt with them both in conversation with people that disagree with me or in lectures and so on. And veritas.org, as well as my own website and now the OCCA website, OCCA.org. There's lots of stuff there, because I'm getting to the stage in life that I can't go on repeating these things in interviews forever.
Well, it's a shame that you can't, because we all love hearing you speak.
Well, that's very kind.
I've just got one final question, before I ask you, John, to sign off, and we're going to we're going to link to everything below, including your fantastic book, 2084. And the final question, you kind of met, and this was one I think perhaps was the most asked question from our audience. And you have an amazing take on this, that has been kind of really transformational in my kind of thinking, and has really opened my mind up on the topic. And you mentioned the resurrection, and one of the, I guess, ideas, and I feel like this brings this conversation really kind of full circle on the topic, is of course people like Richard Dawkins, some of the other, perhaps new atheists. Of course, the idea of miracles, of course, is a complex one. But I'm kind of curious, does those laws of science, of nature, that perhaps someone like a Dawkins would subscribe to, does that preclude the possibility for kind of miracles to happen? We were asked this question by a lot of people. What your take is on that?
Oh, well, I'm not surprised. I get asked it a great deal, and I dealt with it to a certain extent in my debate with Christopher Hitchens, and had a long conversation with him afterwards. He said, "You were a bit heavy on me." With David Hume. I said yes, because David Hume was actually wrong. Now, David Hume, Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, is famous for his statement that miracles violate the laws of nature. Now, we need to say something about that. The word miracle can be misleading. It was a miracle that Jane passed her exam last week. But the New Testament, what we call miracles, it simply means something to be wondered at, in Latin, miraculum. It's much better to talk about a supernatural dimension. The resurrection claims to be something supernatural. It doesn't occur within normal natural phenomena. And what Hume said was that these kind of things, and he actually mentioned resurrections in his book, and that's interesting, they violate the laws of nature. Now, that's false. And it's very interesting. It's very easily seen to be false. And it was very interesting for me to be able to talk to the Anthony Flew, who was a brilliant philosopher and was the Dawkins of his day, who was a world expert on Hume, and came to the view that he'd been wrong about Hume. I asked him about this in high old age, and he said, I'd have to rewrite all my books and I'll never get the chance to do it. It was a wonderfully humble statement for a philosopher to make, because in the end, Flew came to believe in some kind of deistic God. But that's a story for another time. The argument that miracles violate the laws of nature is, well, C.S. Lewis, as usual, told a brilliant illustration to help us get our minds round it. And he imagined, suppose I go down, visit you in Cardiff, and I'm staying in a hotel, and I put £100 in the drawer the first night, another 100 the second night. And I'm about to leave on the morning of the third day, and I open the drawer and I find £50. Now, what do I conclude? Do I say the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of Wales? And that points up where the confusion lies. It's in the nature of law. The laws of nature are not like the laws of a country. The laws of nature are our descriptions of what normally happens. The law of gravity tells me that if I drop a heavy ball, it'll fall towards the center of the earth. But if I'm sitting with you, that doesn't stop you catching it. And you don't break the law of gravity. It's just that you introduce another power into the situation. In other words, that room where we're sitting is not a closed system of cause and effect. And the mistake of many of the new atheists in particular is to view the universe as a closed system of cause and effect. But it isn't. God created the norms to which nature runs. And here's the irony of the thing. If we didn't know the laws of nature, that is the way nature normally works, we wouldn't recognize the supernatural if we saw it. You have to know the regularities in order to recognize an exception, but the exception doesn't break the laws, because nobody is claiming that Jesus rose from the dead as a result of physical forces working in his body 5 minutes before it happened. No. What I claim as a Christian is that God raised him from the dead, which is a very different matter. It's the injection of supernatural power from outside an open system. So it seems to me that Lewis really hit it on the head. And there are many other difficulties with Hume's view, by the way. With his use of cause and effect, you couldn't even formulate a law of nature, but we can leave those aside. And I had quite a chat with Christopher Hitchens about this. I said, Christopher, it's very easy to understand. The trouble with you is you've listened to Dawkins too much of this. So anyway, I feel that argument is very important. After all, Lewis wrote a very interesting book on miracles, which is well worth reading. I would just say that unfortunately, the way it's written, many people find the third or the fourth chapter quite difficult and they give up, that it becomes much easier after that.
Wow. Well, we will check it out. We will link that below. John, this has been such a pleasure. My final question for you that we sign off all our podcasts with is for Professor John Lennox today. What makes a life worth living?
What makes a life worth living is a recognition that it was a gift from God, and therefore living for him and with him is the highest privilege that one could have.
Wow. John, where can these guys connect with you? Do you have anything you want to check out? And we will link to everything below.
They can't connect with me directly because I couldn't cope with it. I had to stop that years ago. They can look at my website and they can find me all over the internet. I'm afraid my contribution now is not an individual interaction. Just think of it. I have hundreds of requests and I can't, I'm sorry, but I have tried to write about many of these things in detail. For example, the Hume argument, I have 2 chapters of it in my book, Gunning for God, which was written some time ago. 2 detailed chapters of the objections to miracle and in particular resurrection.
We will link to everything below. And I just obviously want to just thank you for, we appreciate that, you've had such a long and prolific career and you get so many requests and you've taken the time to come and chat with myself and our audience today. And we're so grateful. And I just really want to thank you for obviously for your academic, for your public contributions over the years. You've brought smile, cheer, and wonderful intellect to so many people. So I really, really do want to thank you for everything.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.